You wake up at 3 in the morning with that familiar weight pressing against your chest, the one that tells you something fundamental has shifted in how you see the world around you. The conversations that once felt meaningful now sound hollow. The pursuits that used to energize you feel somehow beneath your potential, and the very fabric of society seems to operate on principles that no longer make sense to your evolving mind. You find yourself withdrawing from social gatherings, not out of antisocial tendencies, but because the cognitive dissonance between your inner world and the external reality has become too overwhelming to bridge. This is not depression, though it might feel like it sometimes. This is not superiority, though others might perceive it as such. This is the inevitable consequence of reaching what Jean Piaget identified as the highest levels of cognitive development, where the mind becomes capable of abstract reasoning, hypothetical thinking, and systematic problem-solving that most of the adult population never fully achieves. What Piaget discovered through decades of meticulous research with children and adolescents was not just how we learn to think, but how the very structure of our consciousness evolves in predictable stages that fundamentally alter our relationship with reality itself. The most startling revelation from his work was not that children think differently from adults, but that many adults never progress beyond the concrete operational thinking they developed in elementary school, leaving those who do continue evolving feeling increasingly alienated from a world that operates on simpler cognitive principles. Today, I want to show you exactly why the most cognitively developed individuals inevitably find themselves distancing from mainstream society, how this process unfolds according to Piaget's revolutionary framework, and why understanding this phenomenon might be the key to both embracing your intellectual growth and finding meaningful connection in an increasingly complex world. The story begins in 1950s Geneva, where Piaget was conducting what would become one of his most revealing studies on adolescent reasoning. 15-year-old Marie sat across from him in his modest laboratory at the University of Geneva, her eyes focused intently on the apparatus before her. Piaget had presented her with what appeared to be a simple physics problem involving pendulums of different lengths, weights, and starting positions. The task seemed straightforward: determine which factors influence how fast a pendulum swings. But what Piaget was actually measuring had nothing to do with physics knowledge and everything to do with the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. Marie began her investigation systematically, changing one variable at a time while keeping others constant. She tested pendulums of different weights with the same length, then different lengths with the same weight, methodically isolating each factor to determine its individual effect. This approach, which Piaget termed formal operational thinking, represented something far more profound than clever problem-solving. Marie was demonstrating the capacity for hypothetical deductive reasoning, the ability to generate all possible combinations of variables mentally before testing them, and most significantly, the power to think about thinking itself. What made this discovery revolutionary was not that Marie could solve the problem, but how her approach differed fundamentally from the children Piaget had tested just a few years younger. 12-year-old Pierre, when given the same task, would change multiple variables simultaneously, become frustrated when results seemed inconsistent, and rely primarily on trial and error rather than systematic hypothesis testing. Pierre was operating from what Piaget called concrete operational thinking, perfectly adequate for navigating daily life, but fundamentally limited when confronting abstract or hypothetical scenarios. The implications of this cognitive divide began to crystallize for Piaget as he followed these subjects into their adult lives. Marie, now capable of formal operational reasoning, found herself increasingly frustrated with conversations that remained anchored in concrete details rather than exploring underlying principles. She could see multiple perspectives simultaneously, consider hypothetical scenarios, and engage in abstract moral reasoning that allowed her to question societal structures and institutions. Pierre, despite being equally intelligent in many ways, remained more comfortable with discussions focused on immediate, tangible realities and showed less inclination to challenge established systems or engage in speculative thinking. This pattern repeated itself across hundreds of subjects, revealing what Piaget considered one of his most disturbing findings. The majority of adults never fully develop formal operational thinking, remaining cognitively anchored in the concrete operational stage they achieved around age 7 to 11. They can perform complex tasks, hold jobs, raise families, and function effectively in society, but they struggle with abstract reasoning, hypothetical thinking, and the kind of metacognitive awareness that characterizes the highest levels of human intellectual development. For those individuals who do progress to formal operational thinking, typically emerging during adolescence but continuing to deepen throughout life, the social implications are profound and often isolating. They begin to see the arbitrary nature of many social conventions, question authority structures that others accept without examination, and feel frustrated by what they perceive as the intellectual laziness or rigid thinking of their peers. This is not arrogance or elitism, though it is often misinterpreted as such. It is the natural consequence of cognitive development that allows individuals to see patterns, connections, and possibilities that remain invisible to concrete operational thinkers. Piaget documented this phenomenon most clearly in his longitudinal studies of moral reasoning development. Subjects who had achieved formal operational thinking demonstrated what he called autonomous morality, making ethical decisions based on abstract principles of justice, fairness, and human dignity, rather than simply following rules or conforming to social expectations. They could consider multiple perspectives simultaneously, understand the subjective nature of many moral positions, and engage in the kind of nuanced ethical reasoning that often puts them at odds with more black and white thinking prevalent in their communities. Consider the case of Dr. Elizabeth Stern, one of Piaget's most thoroughly documented subjects, whom he followed from childhood through her career as a research scientist. As a child, Elizabeth showed early signs of formal operational thinking, asking questions that went beyond immediate cause and effect to explore underlying mechanisms and principles. By adolescence, she was engaging in hypothetical scenarios, considering multiple variables simultaneously and demonstrating the kind of systematic thinking that characterizes advanced cognitive development. But as Elizabeth entered adulthood, she began to experience what she described to Piaget as a growing sense of isolation from her peers. Conversations that once felt stimulating became predictable and superficial. She found herself anticipating the responses of colleagues before they spoke, not because she was particularly intuitive, but because she could see the cognitive patterns and limitations that constrained their thinking. Social gatherings became exercises in code switching, where she learned to suppress her natural inclination toward abstract discussion in favor of the concrete details and immediate concerns that dominated most interactions. What made Elizabeth's case particularly revealing was how her distancing from mainstream social engagement actually accelerated her intellectual development. Freed from the cognitive conformity pressure that keeps many individuals anchored in conventional thinking patterns, she was able to pursue increasingly abstract and complex ideas that further differentiated her cognitive style from the general population. This created a feedback loop where cognitive development led to social distancing, which enabled further cognitive development, which increased social distance. Piaget observed this pattern across multiple domains of human experience. Individuals with highly developed formal operational thinking often find themselves disconnected from popular entertainment, which they perceive as intellectually unstimulating or emotionally manipulative. They struggle with small talk, not because they lack social skills, but because their minds naturally gravitate toward the kind of abstract connections and hypothetical explorations that most people find exhausting or irrelevant. They become frustrated with educational systems, workplace cultures, and political discussions that operate on oversimplified binary thinking rather than embracing the complexity and nuance that characterizes mature intellectual engagement. The research revealed something even more profound about consciousness itself. Those individuals who achieve the highest levels of cognitive development begin to experience what Piaget termed cognitive loneliness, a form of isolation that comes not from lack of social connection, but from the absence of intellectual peers who can engage at similar levels of abstraction and complexity. They find themselves serving as translators between their inner cognitive world and the external social environment, constantly simplifying their natural thinking patterns to maintain communication with others. This translation process becomes particularly exhausting because it requires continuous metacognitive monitoring. Advanced thinkers must constantly assess the cognitive level of their audience, adjust their communication accordingly, and suppress their natural inclination toward complexity and nuance. Over time, this cognitive code switching becomes so draining that many individuals begin to withdraw from social engagement altogether, preferring solitude or very small circles of similarly developed thinkers. Piaget's most striking discovery was that this withdrawal is not pathological, but adaptive. Just as children naturally gravitate toward playmates at similar developmental levels, cognitively advanced adults instinctively seek environments that match their intellectual capacity. The problem arises because formal operational thinkers represent a small minority of the adult population, making it statistically unlikely that they will find adequate intellectual community in their immediate environment. The isolation deepens when we consider the emotional dimensions of advanced cognitive development. Formal operational thinking enables individuals to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, which often leads to increased empathy, but also to greater emotional complexity. They can understand and feel the pain of others more deeply, see the unintended consequences of actions and policies more clearly, and experience what Piaget called cognitive grief for the suffering that could be prevented if more people were capable of advanced reasoning. This emotional sophistication, combined with their ability to see long-term patterns and consequences, often makes advanced thinkers appear pessimistic or overly serious to their concrete operational peers. They struggle to enjoy simple pleasures when their minds automatically generate awareness of underlying problems, future complications, or ethical implications that others simply do not perceive. This is not psychological dysfunction, but the natural consequence of cognitive architecture that processes information at levels of depth and complexity that most people find overwhelming. Looking at this conversation, I want to pause for a moment because something important is happening here, and I need to know if you are experiencing what I think you might be experiencing. Do you find yourself nodding along with this description, feeling a sense of recognition that is both relieving and somewhat painful? Have you ever felt like you are speaking a different language from the people around you, not because of vocabulary or culture, but because your mind naturally goes to places that others seem unable or unwilling to explore? I know how isolating it can feel to realize that your way of processing the world might be fundamentally different from most of the people in your life. And if this resonates with you, you are definitely not alone in this experience. Leave a comment with this simple phrase, "I think in patterns others cannot see," and let that be a signal to others who might be feeling this same cognitive loneliness, that there are kindred spirits out there. Your willingness to share this might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to realize they are not broken or weird, just operating from a different level of cognitive development. The research data that emerged from Piaget's longitudinal studies painted a clear picture of how cognitive development creates inevitable social stratification. Individuals operating from formal operational thinking naturally cluster together when given the opportunity, forming what researchers now call cognitive affinity groups. These relationships are characterized by the kind of intellectual intimacy that allows for rapid communication of complex ideas, shared appreciation for nuance and ambiguity, and mutual understanding of the cognitive loneliness that comes with advanced development. But the formation of these groups often requires extensive searching and screening, as formal operational thinkers learn to identify potential intellectual peers through subtle cognitive markers. They develop an almost intuitive ability to assess the cognitive level of others through conversation patterns, problem-solving approaches, and responses to ambiguity or complexity. This screening process is rarely conscious or deliberate, but emerges naturally as a protective mechanism against the exhaustion of constant cognitive translation. What Piaget found most troubling about this phenomenon was how it creates parallel societies operating at different levels of cognitive complexity. The concrete operational majority continues to function within established social structures, accepting conventional wisdom, following traditional career paths, and maintaining stability through adherence to proven patterns. Meanwhile, the formal operational minority increasingly operates in intellectual subcultures characterized by questioning, experimentation, and the kind of abstract thinking that can appear threatening or destabilizing to those who prefer cognitive certainty. This cognitive stratification has profound implications for democratic society, educational systems, and cultural evolution. When advanced thinkers withdraw from mainstream engagement, society loses access to the kind of innovative problem-solving and long-term thinking that characterizes formal operational reasoning. Simultaneously, the concentration of advanced thinkers in isolated intellectual communities can lead to the development of ideas and solutions that, while cognitively sophisticated, may be poorly communicated to or understood by the broader population who must ultimately implement them. Piaget observed this dynamic most clearly in his analysis of educational reform movements, where formal operational educators would develop pedagogically sound but conceptually complex curricula that concrete operational teachers could not effectively implement. The resulting educational initiatives would fail not because of poor design, but because of cognitive mismatch between developers and implementers. Similar patterns emerged in organizational consulting, political reform, and social movement leadership, where advanced thinkers would create sophisticated strategies that founded on the cognitive limitations of their intended audience. The personal cost of this cognitive isolation became increasingly apparent as Piaget followed his subjects through their adult lives. Many reported feelings of existential loneliness that persisted despite successful careers, loving relationships, and active social lives. They described a sense of being fundamentally misunderstood, not because others lacked goodwill, but because the cognitive gap made authentic intellectual intimacy nearly impossible to achieve. Dr. Stern, whose case we discussed earlier, exemplified this pattern. Despite achieving significant professional success and maintaining warm personal relationships, she reported to Piaget that she often felt like she was living in two worlds simultaneously. Her public persona required constant simplification and translation of her natural thinking patterns, while her private intellectual life became increasingly rich and complex, but necessarily solitary. She developed what she called cognitive compartmentalization, maintaining separate spaces for different levels of intellectual engagement. This compartmentalization strategy, while adaptive, created its own challenges. Stern found that suppressing her natural cognitive complexity in social situations began to feel inauthentic and draining. She started to experience what psychologists would later recognize as cognitive dissonance between her inner intellectual life and her external social presentation. The energy required to maintain these separate cognitive personas left her feeling exhausted and somewhat fragmented. The breakthrough in Piaget's understanding came when he began to study individuals who had successfully navigated this cognitive isolation by developing what he termed integrative consciousness. These were formal operational thinkers who had learned to bridge the gap between their advanced cognitive capacity and the concrete operational world around them, without sacrificing their intellectual integrity or burning out from constant translation. The key insight was that cognitive development does not stop with formal operations, but continues evolving toward what Piaget called dialectical thinking. This involves the ability to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously, appreciate paradox and ambiguity, and communicate complex ideas through metaphor, story, and experiential learning, rather than pure logical argumentation. Dialectical thinkers could maintain their sophisticated understanding while finding ways to share insights that concrete operational thinkers could access through their preferred learning modalities. This evolution toward dialectical thinking often emerges after a period of withdrawal and isolation, suggesting that the distancing phase may be a necessary developmental stage rather than a permanent condition. Individuals who successfully navigate this transition report that their period of social withdrawal allowed them to fully develop their cognitive capacity without the constant pressure to conform to lower-level thinking patterns. Once they achieved secure intellectual identity, they could re-engage socially from a position of strength rather than compromise. The process typically involves learning to see concrete operational thinking not as intellectual limitation, but as a different cognitive style with its own strengths and appropriate applications. Dialectical thinkers develop appreciation for the stability, practicality, and social cohesion that concrete operational communities provide, while simultaneously maintaining their capacity for abstract reasoning and hypothetical thinking. This cognitive maturity enables them to serve as bridges between different levels of cognitive development, translating advanced ideas into accessible formats without dumbing them down, and helping concrete operational thinkers expand their cognitive capacity gradually and naturally. They become skilled at recognizing the cognitive readiness of their audience and adjusting their communication style accordingly, not as manipulation, but as genuine service to human understanding and connection. Piaget's later research focused on identifying the conditions that support this transition, from isolated formal operational thinking to integrated dialectical consciousness. The factors consistently associated with successful integration included access to intellectual community during the withdrawal phase, engagement with mentors who had successfully navigated the same transition, exposure to wisdom traditions that honored both rational and intuitive ways of knowing, and opportunities to apply abstract thinking to concrete problems with real-world impact. The individuals who achieved this integration reported profound shifts in their experience of social engagement. Rather than feeling cognitively lonely in groups, they began to experience what one subject described as cognitive curiosity about the different ways people processed information. They developed genuine appreciation for cognitive diversity and became skilled at facilitating conversations that honored different thinking styles, while gently expanding everyone's capacity for complexity and nuance. Most significantly, they discovered that their period of social withdrawal had actually prepared them for a deeper level of engagement with the world. Their temporary distance from mainstream social patterns had allowed them to develop independent thinking, authentic values, and genuine empathy for humans struggling that enabled them to contribute more meaningfully to collective problem-solving and community building. This understanding reframes the withdrawal of conscious individuals not as antisocial behavior or intellectual arrogance, but as a necessary developmental phase that can lead to more effective social engagement and greater contribution to human flourishing. The key is recognizing the difference between withdrawal as escape and withdrawal as preparation for more conscious engagement. The transformation process that Piaget documented most extensively occurred in the case of Thomas Müller, a brilliant mathematician who had retreated so completely from social engagement by age 30 that his colleagues began to worry about his mental health. Müller had achieved extraordinary success in abstract mathematical research, but found human interaction increasingly unbearable as his cognitive sophistication deepened. He described everyday conversations as intellectual torture, where he had to constantly suppress his natural thinking patterns to maintain basic social connection. Müller's turning point came during what Piaget called a cognitive crisis, a period of intense psychological discomfort that often precedes breakthrough to dialectical thinking. He had been invited to present his research at a conference for high school mathematics teachers, and his first instinct was to decline, knowing that explaining advanced mathematical concepts to concrete operational thinkers would be exhausting and likely futile. But something compelled him to accept, perhaps what Piaget identified as the natural human drive toward integration and meaningful contribution. The presentation was initially a disaster. Müller began with complex theoretical frameworks that left his audience bewildered and frustrated. He could see the confusion in their faces, feel the cognitive disconnect widening with each abstract concept he introduced. But instead of retreating into his usual pattern of intellectual superiority and social withdrawal, something shifted in Müller's consciousness. He began to see the teachers not as cognitively deficient, but as individuals operating from a different but equally valid way of processing information. This shift in perspective triggered what Piaget termed cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and appreciate different thinking styles without judgment or condescension. Müller found himself genuinely curious about how these teachers approached mathematical concepts, what metaphors and concrete examples resonated with their students, and how abstract principles could be translated into experiential learning opportunities. For the first time in years, he was intellectually stimulated by interaction with concrete operational thinkers. The breakthrough came when Müller began using visual demonstrations, physical manipulatives, and real-world applications to illustrate the mathematical principles he had previously presented in pure abstract form. He watched as concepts that had seemed impossible to communicate suddenly became accessible when presented through concrete, operational learning modalities. The teachers began asking sophisticated questions that revealed deep understanding, even though their approach to the material was fundamentally different from his own. This experience taught Müller something profound about the relationship between cognitive development and human connection. He realized that his withdrawal from social engagement had been based on a false assumption that meaningful intellectual exchange could only occur between individuals at the same cognitive level. His experiments with the mathematics teachers revealed that abstract concepts could be shared across cognitive levels when presented with sufficient creativity, patience, and genuine respect for different thinking styles. Piaget observed that this realization typically marks the beginning of dialectical consciousness, where individuals transcend the either-or thinking that characterizes both concrete and formal operational stages. Muller began to see that the question was not whether to engage with concrete operational thinkers or withdraw from them, but how to create bridges between different cognitive worlds that honored the strengths and limitations of each approach. The practical implications of this shift were dramatic. Muller began volunteering as a mathematics tutor for struggling students, discovering that his advanced understanding actually enhanced his ability to identify exactly where cognitive breakdowns occurred in mathematical reasoning. He could see patterns of confusion that teachers operating at concrete operational levels missed, while simultaneously understanding the concrete learning needs that his formal operational colleagues often overlooked. This experience led Muller to develop what Piaget called cognitive bilingualism, the ability to think fluently in both abstract and concrete modes depending on the situation and audience. He found that this flexibility actually strengthened rather than compromised his capacity for advanced reasoning, as the challenge of translation forced him to understand concepts at deeper levels and identify their essential elements more clearly. The transformation in Muller's social life was equally significant. He began to experience genuine enjoyment in conversations with individuals at all cognitive levels, finding that each interaction offered unique insights and perspectives that enriched his understanding of human nature and social dynamics. He developed appreciation for the emotional intelligence, practical wisdom, and social skills that often characterize concrete operational thinkers, recognizing these as valuable forms of intelligence that complemented rather than competed with abstract reasoning ability. Piaget documented similar transformations across multiple subjects, identifying common patterns in the transition from isolated formal operational thinking to integrated dialectical consciousness. The process typically began with a crisis of meaning, where individuals questioned whether their cognitive gifts were valuable if they led to social isolation and inability to contribute meaningfully to collective human endeavors. This crisis often triggered a period of experimentation with different approaches to social engagement and communication. The successful transitions consistently involved what Piaget called cognitive courage, the willingness to risk misunderstanding, rejection, or intellectual compromise in service of genuine human connection. Individuals had to overcome their fear of being cognitively diminished by association with less abstract thinkers, while simultaneously learning to trust that their intellectual integrity could survive the challenge of translation and adaptation. Most importantly, they had to develop faith that their cognitive gifts were meant to serve not just their own intellectual satisfaction, but the broader human community. This required a fundamental shift from seeing cognitive development as a personal achievement to understanding it as a form of social responsibility. Advanced thinkers began to see themselves as cognitive stewards, responsible for using their gifts in ways that elevated collective understanding rather than simply pursuing individual intellectual gratification. The research revealed that this transition rarely occurs without significant support and modeling from others who have successfully navigated the same developmental challenge. Piaget identified the crucial role of what he called cognitive mentors, individuals who had achieved dialectical consciousness and could demonstrate how to maintain intellectual integrity while engaging meaningfully across cognitive levels. These mentors typically possessed several key characteristics that made them effective guides for isolated formal operational thinkers. They had preserved their capacity for advanced reasoning while developing genuine appreciation for concrete operational thinking. They had learned to communicate complex ideas through story, metaphor, and experiential learning rather than relying solely on logical argumentation. Most importantly, they had developed emotional maturity that allowed them to remain patient and compassionate when faced with cognitive limitations in others. The mentoring process often involved helping isolated thinkers recognize that their withdrawal from society, while developmentally necessary, had become a limitation rather than a strength. Cognitive mentors helped them see that true intellectual courage required engagement with the messy complexity of human social reality rather than retreat into the clean abstractions of pure thought. This guidance typically challenged several assumptions that kept advanced thinkers isolated. They had to release the belief that intellectual integrity required communicating at their highest cognitive level at all times. They had to overcome the assumption that concrete operational thinkers were inherently less intelligent rather than differently intelligent. Most fundamentally, they had to abandon the idea that social engagement necessarily required cognitive compromise or intellectual dishonesty. The mentoring relationship provided a safe space for advanced thinkers to experiment with different communication styles and approaches to social engagement without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. Cognitive mentors could appreciate both the sophistication of their protégés' thinking and the challenge of translating that thinking into forms that served broader human understanding. Piaget noted that the most effective mentors had often experienced similar periods of social withdrawal and cognitive isolation in their own development, giving them credibility and empathy that theoretical understanding alone could not provide. They could validate the reality of cognitive loneliness while simultaneously demonstrating that it was a transitional rather than permanent condition. The transformation process typically culminated in what Piaget called cognitive integration, where advanced thinkers achieved comfort moving fluidly between different levels of abstraction depending on the needs of each situation. They developed intuitive sensitivity to the cognitive capacity of their audience while maintaining their own capacity for complex reasoning. Most importantly, they learned to find intellectual stimulation and personal satisfaction in the challenge of effective translation and bridge building between cognitive worlds. This integration marked the emergence of what Piaget considered the highest form of human cognitive development, where intellectual gifts were placed in service of collective human flourishing rather than personal intellectual gratification. These individuals became capable of contributing to society in ways that honored both their advanced cognitive capacity and the cognitive reality of the broader human community. But the journey to this integration was rarely smooth or predictable, and Piaget's research revealed several critical factors that determined whether advanced thinkers successfully navigated this transition or remained trapped in cognitive isolation. Understanding these factors would prove crucial for anyone seeking to bridge the gap between their inner intellectual world and meaningful engagement with the cognitive diversity of human society. The factors that determined successful cognitive integration versus continued isolation became the focus of Piaget's most intensive research during his later years, as he recognized that understanding this transition held the key to unleashing the full potential of advanced cognitive development for human benefit. His longitudinal studies revealed three critical elements that distinguished those who successfully bridged cognitive worlds from those who remained trapped in intellectual exile. The first factor was what Piaget termed cognitive humility, a paradoxical quality where individuals became more rather than less confident in their intellectual abilities, precisely because they stopped needing to prove their superiority. This humility emerged when advanced thinkers recognized that their cognitive gifts were not personal achievements, but developmental outcomes that carried responsibility for service to others. They began to see their abstract reasoning abilities as tools for understanding and solving human problems, rather than markers of personal worth or social status. Cognitive humility manifested in practical ways that surprised many of Piaget's colleagues. Advanced thinkers who developed this quality became genuinely curious about how others approach problems, recognizing that different cognitive styles often revealed aspects of reality that pure abstract reasoning missed. They learned to ask questions rather than provide answers, to listen more than they spoke, and to find intellectual stimulation in understanding rather than being understood. The transformation was particularly evident in how these individuals handled disagreement and intellectual conflict. Instead of becoming frustrated or dismissive when others failed to grasp complex concepts, they became fascinated by the cognitive processes that led to different conclusions. They began to see intellectual disagreement as an opportunity for mutual learning rather than a battle to be won through superior reasoning. The second critical factor was cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt thinking styles to match the needs of each situation without losing access to higher-order reasoning capabilities. This flexibility required what Piaget called metacognitive awareness, consciousness of one's own thinking processes, and the ability to deliberately shift between different cognitive modes. Piaget documented this development through the case of Dr. Sarah Chen, a theoretical physicist who had withdrawn almost completely from social engagement after completing her doctorate at age 24. Chen described feeling like she was living in a different cognitive universe from most people, unable to find satisfying intellectual conversation or meaningful connection with colleagues who hadn't achieved formal operational thinking. Chen's breakthrough came during a volunteer experience teaching science to elementary school children. Initially, she approached the task with the same abstract reasoning that characterized her research, attempting to explain complex physics concepts through mathematical equations and theoretical frameworks. The results were predictably disastrous, with confused children and frustrated teachers questioning her ability to communicate effectively. But rather than abandoning the effort or blaming the children for cognitive limitations, Chen became genuinely curious about how young minds actually processed scientific information. She began studying Piaget's research on concrete operational thinking, learning to observe the specific ways children approach problems and organize their understanding of physical phenomena. This study led to a revelation that transformed Chen's entire approach to both teaching and research. She discovered that children's concrete thinking often revealed fundamental physical principles that her abstract training had obscured. Their direct experiential engagement with materials and phenomena provided insights into the essential nature of scientific concepts that purely mathematical approaches sometimes missed. Chen began developing what she called embodied physics, an approach to scientific education that honored both the concrete operational learning needs of children and the formal operational insights of advanced physics. She created hands-on experiments that allowed children to discover fundamental principles through direct experience, while simultaneously reinforcing the abstract mathematical relationships that described those principles. The process of developing these educational approaches actually enhanced Chen's own research capabilities. The challenge of explaining complex concepts in concrete terms forced her to understand physical principles at deeper levels, revealing new connections and insights that purely abstract analysis had missed. She found that her ability to think flexibly between concrete and abstract modes made her a more creative and effective researcher, not a less sophisticated one. This cognitive flexibility began transforming Chen's social relationships as well. She learned to recognize the cognitive style that each conversation partner was using and adapt her communication accordingly without feeling that she was compromising her intellectual integrity. She developed appreciation for the practical wisdom, emotional intelligence, and social skills that characterize many concrete operational thinkers, recognizing these as forms of intelligence that complemented rather than competed with abstract reasoning. The third critical factor that Piaget identified was cognitive purpose, a clear sense of how advanced thinking abilities could serve meaningful goals beyond personal intellectual satisfaction. Individuals who successfully integrated their cognitive gifts with social engagement had developed what he called intellectual mission, understanding that their advanced reasoning capabilities were meant to contribute to solving real human problems and advancing collective understanding. This sense of purpose typically emerged through what Piaget called cognitive service experiences, situations where advanced thinkers used their gifts to help others understand complex concepts, solve difficult problems, or navigate challenging intellectual terrain. These experiences revealed that the greatest intellectual satisfaction came not from impressing others with cognitive superiority, but from using advanced reasoning to create genuine value for human communities. The development of cognitive purpose often required overcoming what Piaget identified as intellectual narcissism, the tendency to use cognitive gifts primarily for personal gratification rather than service to others. This narcissism was not necessarily conscious or malicious, but represented a developmental stage where individuals were still learning to integrate their advanced reasoning abilities with mature social consciousness. The transition from intellectual narcissism to cognitive service typically involved recognizing that true intellectual fulfillment required engagement with the cognitive diversity of human society rather than retreat into abstract isolation. Advanced thinkers had to learn that their gifts were most meaningful when they contributed to collective human flourishing rather than individual intellectual achievement. Piaget's research revealed that this transition was often triggered by encountering real human suffering that could potentially be alleviated through the application of advanced reasoning. Individuals who had been content to pursue abstract intellectual interests for their own sake suddenly found themselves motivated to use their cognitive gifts to address concrete problems that affected real people's lives. The integration of cognitive humility, flexibility, and purpose created what Piaget considered the highest form of human intellectual development. These individuals became capable of moving fluidly between different cognitive worlds, serving as bridges between abstract and concrete thinking, and using their advanced reasoning abilities to enhance rather than escape from human community. They developed what he called cognitive wisdom, the ability to know when abstract reasoning was helpful and when other forms of intelligence were more appropriate. They learned to value emotional intelligence, practical skills, and social wisdom as legitimate forms of human intelligence that complemented rather than competed with formal operational thinking. Most importantly, they discovered that their cognitive gifts were most satisfying when used in service of purposes larger than personal intellectual gratification. They found deep fulfillment in helping others understand complex concepts, in translating abstract insights into practical solutions, and in contributing their reasoning abilities to collective problem-solving efforts. The research showed that individuals who achieved this integration reported higher levels of life satisfaction, more meaningful relationships, and greater sense of purpose than those who remained cognitively isolated. They had learned to see their intellectual gifts as resources for building human community rather than barriers to social connection. But perhaps most significantly, they had discovered that true intellectual courage required engagement with the full complexity of human cognitive diversity rather than retreat into the safety of abstract thought. They learned that the greatest intellectual challenges and rewards came from the effort to bridge different ways of knowing and create understanding across cognitive differences. This discovery transforms everything about how we understand intellectual giftedness and social responsibility. If you found yourself withdrawing from a world that feels cognitively overwhelming, If you've wondered whether your deep thinking is a gift or a burden, Piaget's research offers profound hope. Your withdrawal isn't a character flaw. It's a developmental stage that can lead to the most meaningful form of intellectual contribution possible. The most conscious people aren't distancing themselves from the world permanently. They're preparing to re-engage with greater wisdom, deeper empathy, and more effective ways of sharing their gifts. Your cognitive abilities aren't meant to isolate you. They're meant to serve as bridges between different ways of understanding reality. If this journey resonates with you, if you're ready to discover how to transform your intellectual depth into genuine human connection, join our community exploring these transformative insights every week. Your unique perspective is exactly what we need to better understand how human consciousness can evolve toward greater wisdom and compassion. Next week, we'll explore why highly intelligent children often struggle to connect with their peers and how Piaget's developmental stages can help parents and educators nurture giftedness without creating social isolation. You'll discover specific strategies for honoring intellectual gifts while developing the emotional skills that make meaningful relationships possible across cognitive differences.